watching Beyond Markets, where we bring you up to speed on development outcomes in Africa. Welcome, I'm Esther Awoniyi. Many thanks for joining us. On today's show, we'll explore the world of sustainable finance and find out what new trends are appealing to investors. As always, you can join the conversation on social media. Let me know what you think about the topics we discuss. And to do so, you can use the hashtag Beyond Markets. You can also send me a message on my Twitter handle. It's at Esther O. Awoniyi. Now, the United Nations Environment Programme Inquiry into the design of a sustainable financial system has been working with 6 countries, namely China, Kazakhstan, Nigeria, India, Mexico, and Mongolia, which have been keen to advance ambitious national sustainable finance agendas. Marcos Mancini, head of international cooperation at UNEP Inquiry, joins me as we discuss some trends that are shaping the sustainable finance landscape. Thank you, Marcos. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we take a deep dive, I'd just like you to just help us understand the state of sustainable finance on the continent. We're at a time where the sustainability conversation is gaining more momentum. We're talking about environment, social, and of course governance for companies, how companies interact with the environment. But now investors across the globe are also looking to invest more in companies that can show, that they're also doing better with the environment. But I'd just like you to just share with us your assessment of sustainable finance on the continent.
Yeah, well, sustainable finance has been gaining momentum globally. I would say that mainly the 2 global milestones that have sort of sprung this momentum are the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda from the United Nations. Going specifically into sustainable finance, as you've well pointed out, investors are more and more interested. Investors, as you probably reported through the finance, are getting low yields in developed markets, so they are looking into developing markets, and there are particularly a lot of investors that have commitments related to the Paris Agreement or the 2030 Agenda. They're looking to align their portfolios to both of these targets. Mm-hmm. And given that they are looking to align their portfolios, and they're getting low yields in developed markets, they're looking at emerging markets.
And I'm just curious, because there's so much buzz around
Yes.
Sustainable finance right now. I'm just trying to pinpoint at what point it became so prominent, as it were. I know that this is something that's been long time coming. We've been talking a lot about climate change. Yes. And how the activities of man have been impacting the environment. But I'm just wondering, at what point did it really become a thing, as it were?
Well, we've been tracking different initiatives, different sustainable finance initiatives, back since our tracking goes back to 1992, when UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative, was established, which is a partnership between the financial sector and UNEP. Since 1992 up until today, initiatives have grown at about, I would say, 4 initiatives per year. And by initiatives, I mean either commitments, either principles at an international level, such as the principles for responsible investment, principles for sustainable insurance. But there's a break in that line, in that increase, which is around 2009, which was when the G20 in Pittsburgh established in its communiqué, said that it was important to phase out from fossil fuels. So from 2009 onwards, we've seen that there is about 7 initiatives launched per year.
Well, so it's sort of difficult to pinpoint what that exact catalyst was.
Yes, if I were to... Sorry.
The key that moved the needle, as it were. Continue.
Yeah, sorry. If I were to be more specific, I would say that in around 2015, the G20 asked the Financial Stability Board to understand climate-related financial risks. So the Financial Stability Board established the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. which started in 2016 and delivered its results in 2017. Now about 100 asset managers and asset owners comprising $135 trillion are sort of behind this initiative. So you have a lot of investor power trying to drive that commitment from companies to disclose in their financial filings climate-related risks.
That's a lot of muscle. But would you say that, I'm just wondering, at the point where these companies were also brought to the table, what was the reception? Was there a pushback? Because it was sort of new at that time, but how was it embraced? How quickly was it embraced by these companies?
I would say that it took some time, but if we look at the time when the TCFD was launched and the time currently, the adoption curve has been sort of quite fast, because companies had been working on these issues before, but now we're seeing a real investor pressure to advance the agenda.
Okay, speaking about agenda, let's talk about the UN Environment Programme, the inquiry into the design of a sustainable financial system. And we're seeing the UN working with 6 countries, China, Kazakhstan, and Nigeria. Talk to us about this and how the UN is advancing that cause.
Yeah, so we're working with these countries that you mentioned. In most of the countries, we had been working before. So in China, in Mongolia, in Nigeria, for example, we had developed extensive work. In Nigeria, for example, we did with FMDQ the Nigerian Sustainable Finance Roadmap. Same in Mongolia. But all the countries have had quite seminal work on sustainable finance, and based on the groundwork that was already laid off, we identified priorities to continue advancing the sustainable finance agenda. Now, the inquiry into the design of a sustainable financial system works particularly with, I would say, greening the rules of the game. So we try to work with financial regulators to understand how, through regulation, one can redirect capital to greener projects.
So I'm just, because the 1 or 2 African countries on this, well, just one African country actually, and that's Nigeria. But for Africa, this conversation around sustainable finance, at what point would you say one could say Africa came fully on board and began to realize the benefits? Obviously, we're all in a global village, obviously, so this couldn't have been happening in developed markets. At some point, emerging markets, developing markets would get on board. But I'm just wondering, the Africa coming on board, what was that like? Well,
it's funny that you mentioned that, because just in the launch of the event today, I was sharing my experience on how, when the Nigerian sustainable banking principles, which were launched in, if I'm correct, in 2012, served as a reference, not only, I'm guessing, within Africa, but globally, internationally. South Africa, for example, is another example where the banking sector initially sort of moved a lot this agenda. So from a governance perspective, the King Code, which are the governance framework, are very much sort of a reference point internationally. Several stock exchanges in the continent are members of the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, which looks to understand how, through disclosure and transparency, particularly in sustainability indicators related to environmental aspects, social or governance aspects, investors can make better decisions.
Okay, I wanted to quickly talk about Nigeria. Now, Nigeria already has an existing roadmap but it does highlight a number of barriers: market failures, information asymmetries, lack of awareness. Could you just elaborate further on that, in working with Nigeria?
Yes. So the work that we did with Nigeria was, I believe, 2 years ago. It was, as I was saying, in partnership with FMDQ. We surveyed several financial institutions to identify opportunities, to identify market barriers. And one of the the opportunities that came up in that study, and hence what gave origin to the project that we were launching today, was the developing of a tagging system. Now, this is something that has been addressed as a barrier also at an international level in the G20 and other forums. What do we mean by tagging? By tagging, we mean basically developing a taxonomy to be able to define in the financial assets what's green and what's not green. The whole idea behind this is that through an identification of what's green or what's not green, one can then try to develop the right incentives to, again, as I was saying originally, redirect capital towards greener projects.
Okay, but in addition to that, I'm just wondering, what is the overall expected outcomes of this inquiry project?
Each country is at a different stage.
Absolutely.
in a sustainable finance roadmap, if you will. So based on that roadmap, based on that priorities identified, we are doing different projects in different countries. But the end game is to green the rules of the game.
Well, what comes next now? You've had this event, the green tagging. I want you to elaborate further.
Yeah.
What are the steps that are going to be taken? What are the expected outcomes? What is the role of each participant? And what is the big picture? Yeah,
so we are working, as I was saying, with FMDQ, with the Climate Bond Initiative, and with other partners to develop three objectives, basically. One is to look into banks' portfolios and identify the amount of green assets, the amount of brown assets. The amount of brown assets, going back to the reference I was making of TCFD, will give us an idea of the climate-related financial risks in the bank's portfolios. Second step is provide strategic recommendations on financial products, how to migrate those assets into capital markets, to provide investable assets for all those trillions of dollars of capital looking to invest in green. And the third component is think about a reporting framework on how financial institutions can report on their portfolios, again, green and brown, thinking that you need to increase the green and you need to understand the risk that the brown poses. Okay, Marcus,
we're going to have to pause at this point. Thank you for your time so far. We'll come back and pick up from where we left off. I've been speaking to Marcus Mancini. He's the head of international cooperation at the United Nations Environment Program Inquiry. You're just joining us, Marcus Mancini, head of international cooperation at the United Nations Environment Program Inquiry, is our guest today on the show, and we've been exploring sustainable finance. Marcus, thank you for your time so far.
Thank you very much.
Now, the green tagging project, you've met with the financial institutions here, but I'm just wondering, why Nigeria?
Why Nigeria? Great question. So Nigeria, through FC4S Lagos, FC4S is the Financial Centers for Sustainability Network, is a member, and so we had two very important components. The roadmap I was just mentioning before, that we did a couple of years ago for Nigeria, and Nigeria had recently become a member of FC4S, the Financial Centers for Sustainability.
Well, how does this initiative align with Nigeria's Green Bond?
Pretty much, I would say. So, if you want to develop the green bond market, obviously you need to let's take a step back.
Okay.
Remember, green bonds are basically just traditional debt instrument, but the use of proceeds is directed to green projects. So. Big issuers usually in several countries are financial institutions. They issue so as to gain liquidity to continue lending in the market. Now, usually financial institutions haven't identified in their portfolio what's green and what's brown. So the objective of the project is to identify what's green, and hopefully that would lead to sort of more issuances.
Would you say that there was a broad buy-in into this? Obviously, I want to believe that the financial services sector here in Nigeria appreciates and understands the importance, of going green, as it were, because of the whole where we are with climate change. But I'm just wondering, in reality, because sometimes, we talk theory, but then in practice, sometimes we see something different. But would you say that from the body language, from all that, from your interactions, that there was a broad buy-in?
Well, the buy-in, let me put it like this. The buy-in from the institutions that we interacted with was good.
Okay.
We can't, at this point, ramp up and do the analysis for the entire financial system. But
that's fair. That is fair.
We're doing a pilot test, and hopefully, with the results that we get from this pilot test, we'll gain more interest from other financial institutions.
But what is your assessment so far, looking at a country like Nigeria, how the financial sector has developed and how the regulator and the players within the sector are now actually looking to get on board, with green projects, be more responsible business leaders and operators within the environment, within the financial system? Just comparing that to maybe some other countries that you see are probably still trying to put, even perhaps an agenda or framework together. What is your assessment?
Yeah, well, so let me compare it with Mexico,
okay,
which is also, as Nigeria, a sort of a resource-intensive economy. Mexico took a lot from Nigeria's example with the banking principles. Actually, the banking principles in sustainable banking principles in several countries in Latin America were drafted taking into consideration the Nigerian sustainable banking principles. So aside from the banking principles, there are several Nigeria banks who are members of what we call the PRB, which are the Principles for Responsible Banking,
okay,
which were launched last September during the General Assembly. Just to be a little bit more specific,
okay,
with the Principles of Responsible Banking, banks are committing to align in their portfolios to the 2030 agenda. So that obviously includes green.
Now, with the UNEP Inquiry project, will the list of the countries, is this going to expand anytime soon, these 6 countries? I'm just curious how this works. Is this just a one-off, or will there be more going forward?
We are working with other countries.
Oh, okay.
This is a particular project that is
okay,
covered under the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, which was looking at sort of the continuation of roadmaps or development of roadmaps in other countries.
Okay, now if this green tagging, if it does take root and we have, participants, stakeholders, coming on board and, it progress as, you're hoping, the UN is hoping that it will, how does that change how they take advantage of the opportunities, how these opportunities will advance, the green cause, as it were, and what is that, if it all pans out well, hypothetically speaking now, what kind of world, are we going to see as a result of that?
Well, let me start by the second part of your question, on the what kind of world, because on the sustainable finance space, just yesterday, the UK launched its finance track for the COP, for the climate change COP, which, as you know, is the sort of annual meeting where the negotiation takes place. Now it's the first time that finance track is launched by a central bank governor. Mark Carney launched that, the governor of Bank of England, and he specifically put a lot of stress in what we've been discussing: taxonomy, climate-related risks. So now taking a step back and looking into Nigeria, I see this as a project that Nigeria can talk of during the COP, for example. In the same way, several countries took on and benchmarked against the Nigerian sustainable banking principles. This is something other countries can look at and look to replicate. Not that many. While some countries are working on taxonomies and tagging, not all countries are doing this.
When you say countries, are you talking about countries within the African continent?
Worldwide.
Worldwide. Because I'm particular about the African continent because, there's also the risk of some countries being left behind. But this is if we're talking environment, if we're talking reducing carbon footprint, everyone should be on board, no matter the size of the economy. But I'm just wondering, is there a risk here for those countries who maybe at early stages or who haven't even started to begin to put together these document or agendas?
Well, there's obviously a risk. Christine Lagarde from the European Central Bank yesterday made a speech in relation to this launch at COP, and she mentioned, and among the risks that she mentioned is the risk of a slow transition. The idea is to obviously have a just transition and leave no one behind, as you were just mentioning. We realize and recognize that the transition will need to happen fast, according to sort of international scientific data.
But are there things we can do to speed up the process, or does everyone need to go at their own pace?
Excellent question. I'm just flying in from Cote d'Ivoire, where the Sherpa meeting for the Finance Minister Coalition for Climate Action took place. The Finance Minister Coalition was established last year. The first Sherpa meeting took place last year in Chile. It's being chaired by Chile and Finland, but it has about 55 members, so 55 countries members of the coalition, and the coalition has 5 principles. So these are countries committing to advancing this agenda. There are obviously principles about aligning to Paris. There are principles about sort of sharing how countries are advancing this agenda. But I would say the main 3 principles are around pricing carbon, around integrating climate change into macroeconomic and fiscal budgeting procurement considerations. And the third one is on how to mobilize private finance.
But I have a feeling that the second one could be a difficult one, the macro side of things.
Yeah, I would say that the 2 newest things globally are climate change stress testing, so macroprudential stress testing for financial system, and macroeconomic sort of forecasting integrating climate change. So that is something that it's, I would say, being developed globally, but the IMF and the World Bank do provide technical assistance on this aspect.
Okay. Now, for individual countries, maybe like a country like Nigeria also, but speaking generally still, what should be the role of regulators at this point? Is this a time when they need to step up and take the lead?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is Finance Minister Coalition is a regulatory network.
Okay.
It depends on the country. Sometimes the banking regulator is the central bank. Sometimes the banking regulator is under the umbrella of the finance ministry. So it's different in each country, but there is also this other network that's called the Network for Greening the Financial System, and GFS, which is also a network mainly of central bankers who are also calling the attention of the role of central banks in macroprudential sort of climate change stress testing,
okay,
and integrating sort of a climate change thinking into the monetary policy framework.
Okay. Now, for the carbon pricing, I know that also could be a challenge, but what challenges, what bumps ahead on the road do you see, and what chances are there of it being quickly, resolved so that we can all move on?
Great question.
I know that's
that's a tough one. I wish I had a global answer for that one. But I would say definitely political will. Investors are, as I was saying, committing more and more. So there is capital looking for this type of investments. Investors recognize this risk, and as long as investors start integrating these risks and maybe regulators start stress testing financial systems to this kind of risk and realize there is a risk coming up from climate change, then action will follow.
Absolutely. Well, Marcus, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed for your time today. I've been speaking to Marcus Mancini. He's a head of international cooperation at the United Nations Environment Program Inquiry. Well, that's our show for today. Many thanks for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of the show on our website. That's cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets, and you can follow my Twitter handle too. It's at Esther Awoniyi. For myself and the team, it's bye for now.